It was a quiet Friday night, and I had the house to myself. My parents had gone out for dinner, leaving me alone for the evening. At first, I was excited. I had the TV remote to myself, a fridge full of snacks, and no one to tell me to clean up my mess. The house felt peaceful in that way that only an empty house can do. I settled onto the couch in the living room with a bowl of popcorn and started flipping through Netflix, trying to find something to watch. I finally settled on a true crime documentary and dimmed the lights, letting the glow of the TV fill the room. The wind was picking up outside, making the trees sway, their shadows dancing across the walls. About 20 minutes into the documentary, I heard a sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping. I paused the show, listening closely. It was so faint I wasn't sure if it was real or just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. I muted the TV and sat still, my heart beating a little faster. The sound was coming from the back of the house, near the kitchen. I told myself it was probably just the wind, but curiosity got the best of me. I got up, quietly making my way down the hallway, my socks muffling the sound of my footsteps. The tapping continued as I approached the kitchen. It was louder now, more distinct. It was definitely coming from one of the windows. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe a branch was hitting the glass, or perhaps a loose shutter was banging against the frame. But when I reached the kitchen and looked out the window over the sink, I saw nothing. No tree branches close enough to hit the window, no loose shutters. Just darkness outside, with the wind gently rustling the bushes. I exhaled, laughing at myself for being so paranoid. I must have been imagining things, my mind playing tricks on me after watching too many crime shows. I turned to head back to the living room, but as I did, there it was again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it came from the window to my right, the one next to the back door. I froze. The tapping was deliberate, slow, and it sent chills down my spine. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I slowly turned my head toward the window. There, pressed against the glass, was a hand. A pale, thin hand with long fingers that were tapping lightly on the window pane. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively stepped back, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I couldn't see a face, just the hand, as if whoever it belonged to was crouched just out of view. The tapping continued, soft but insistent, like it was trying to get my attention. I stood there, rooted to the spot, trying to decide what to do. Should I call the police? Should I run out the front door? My mind raced with possibilities, but my body refused to move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from that hand, and then, as suddenly as it appeared, the hand was gone. The tapping stopped, and the wind outside seemed to grow louder, filling the silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing else happened. The backyard was quiet, the darkness outside still. I slowly backed away from the window, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I grabbed my phone from the counter and bolted back to the living room, locking the front door behind me. My hands were shaking as I dialed my parents, desperate for them to pick up. When they finally did, I stammered out what had happened. They were only 10 minutes away and promised to come home immediately. I sat on the couch, clutching my phone, my eyes darting around the room, expecting to hear that tapping again at any moment. But the house remained eerily silent until I heard the familiar sound of the garage door opening. My parents rushed inside, and I told them everything. My dad went outside to check around the house, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no disturbances. Nothing. To this day, I still don't know who or what was tapping on that window. But every time I'm home alone and hear a strange noise, I can't help but think about that pale hand and wonder if it's out there, somewhere, waiting for another quiet night to return. It was a Friday night, and I was home alone. My parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving me to take care of the house. I was 17, old enough to be trusted, but young enough that a night alone still held a hint of unease. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that it would be a quiet evening of video games and snacks. After making a quick dinner, I settled into the living room. The house was unusually quiet, with only the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. I turned on the TV to drown out the silence, choosing a light comedy to keep the mood easy. But despite my efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than usual, and the creaks of the house seemed louder. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the hours passed, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I decided to double check that all the doors and windows were locked, more for peace of mind than anything else. I did a quick round of the house, making sure everything was secure. By the time I finished, it was close to midnight. I returned to the living room, trying to relax. Just as I was starting to feel comfortable again, there was a soft knock at the front door. I froze. Who would be knocking at this hour? My mind immediately went to the worst possibilities: a stranger, a burglar, someone who didn't have good intentions. I hesitated, unsure if I should answer. Maybe it was just a neighbor or someone who needed help, I thought. But the uncertainty gnawed at me. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I crept toward the door, keeping my footsteps as quiet as possible. The peephole in the door loomed ahead of me, a small window to the unknown. I slowly leaned in, my heart pounding in my chest, and peered through. There was no one there. A wave of relief washed over me, mixed with confusion. Maybe it was just a prank, kids from the neighborhood messing around. I decided to let it go and stepped away from the door. But then, I heard it again, a knock, this time from the back of the house. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. Someone was knocking on the back door now. My pulse quickened as I realized this wasn't some random prank. Whoever it was, they were trying to mess with me. I moved slowly, inching my way through the kitchen toward the back door. The curtains were drawn over the small window that looked out onto the backyard, and I hesitated, not wanting to see what was on the other side. My hand hovered over the curtain for a moment before I quickly pulled it back. There was nothing. The backyard was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the security light. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the fence stood undisturbed. But as I scanned the yard, my eye caught something, a faint outline, just at the edge of the light. Someone was standing there, barely visible in the shadows. I gasped and stumbled back, my mind racing. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I wasn't about to find out. I dashed back to the living room and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with trembling hands. The operator answered quickly, and I stammered out what was happening. She assured me that help was on the way and told me to stay on the line until the police arrived. I huddled in the corner of the living room, my eyes fixed on the back door, waiting for the figure to move, to come closer. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, I saw the flash of blue and red lights through the front windows. The police had arrived. I unlocked the door and let them in, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. They searched the property, but when they returned, they had no answers. There were no signs of anyone. No footprints, no evidence of someone being in the yard. It was as if the figure I had seen was a ghost, vanishing into the night without a trace. The officers assured me that they would patrol the area for the rest of the night and advised me to keep the doors locked. I thanked them, but as they left, the unease remained. I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing in the shadows, watching me. Even now, whenever I'm home alone, I find myself glancing out the windows, half expecting to see that dark outline lurking at the edge of the light, waiting for the right moment to knock again. I always enjoyed having the house to myself. It felt like a small taste of independence. My parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving me alone for the first time in a while. I was 17, capable of taking care of myself, and excited for a quiet night. I planned to binge watch a few horror movies, ironically enough. I didn't think much about it, even though the idea of watching them alone made my nerves tingle with anticipation. The house was quiet, too quiet, but I liked it that way. After dinner, I curled up on the couch, a blanket wrapped around me, and pressed play on the first movie. The opening credits started rolling, and I felt the familiar comfort of being lost in someone else's sphere. I wasn't scared, at least not yet, but as the first hour passed, I began to feel a strange heaviness in the air. It wasn't the movie that was making me uneasy. It was something else, a feeling I couldn't quite place. The house creaked as it usually did, but every noise seemed louder, sharper. I glanced at the hallway leading to the bedrooms, half expecting to see something standing there in the darkness. But there was nothing, just the empty corridor and the soft hum of the air conditioning. I shook it off and returned to the movie. I was being paranoid. I knew that. Still, the feeling of being watched nagged at me, refusing to let go. I paused the movie and listened carefully. Nothing, just the ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional sound of the house settling. Then, I heard it, a faint whisper. Just at the edge of hearing, I froze, straining to listen. It was so quiet that I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it at all. But then it came again, soft, barely their sound. It was coming from the hallway. I muted the TV and stood up, heart pounding. I took a few hesitant steps toward the hallway, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back, to lock myself in my room, to call someone, anyone. But curiosity won out, as it often does. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't words, just a soft hissing sound, like someone breathing too close to my ear. I flicked on the hallway light, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway was empty, stretching out into darkness where the light didn't quite reach. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. This was ridiculous. I was alone. The house was empty. There was no one here but me. But the whisper persisted, now coming from the end of the hallway, near my bedroom. My feet moved before I could stop them, carrying me closer to the source of the sound. The door to my room was ajar, just as I had left it. The light from the hallway spilled inside, casting long shadows across the floor. I stepped closer, and the whispering stopped. The silence was thick, pressing in around me. I held my breath, waiting for anything to happen. But there was nothing, no sound, no movement. Just the stillness of the empty house. I reached out and pushed the door open wider, revealing my room. It looked exactly as I had left it, the bed unmade, clothes strewn across the floor, the desk cluttered with schoolwork. Everything was normal, but that feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, was stronger than ever. I took a step inside, and I was scanning the room for any sign of movement. And that's when I saw it. The closet door, which I always kept closed, was slightly open. Just a crack, barely noticeable. My stomach twisted in knots. I never left it open, never. I stared at the door, my mind racing. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know what was on the other side. But I couldn't just leave it like that. Slowly, I reached out and grasped the handle, my fingers trembling. I took a deep breath and yanked the door open. Nothing. The closet was empty. Just my clothes hanging neatly on their hangers, shoes lined up on the floor. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. As I stepped back, I heard the whisper again right behind me. I spun around, hard in my throat, but there was no one there. The room was as empty as before, but the whisper was real. I heard it as clearly as if someone had spoken right into my ear. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop until I was back in the living room, my back pressed against the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I grabbed my phone and dialed my mom's number, needing to hear a familiar voice, to feel grounded in reality again. She picked up on the second ring, and as soon as I heard her voice, the tension eased slightly. I didn't tell her what had happened. What could I say? That I had heard whispers in an empty house. Instead, I made up an excuse about feeling a bit anxious being alone, and she reassured me, promising they'd be home soon. I ended the call and sat down on the couch, trying to calm my racing heart. The whisper was gone, and the house was quiet again, but the feeling of being watched never. I had never considered myself the jumpy type. I was comfortable being alone, even in the dead of night. I had grown up in the suburbs, where the scariest thing to happen was a power outage during a thunderstorm. So, when my parents decided to take a weekend trip, leaving me alone in the house for the first time, I wasn't worried. In fact, I was looking forward to the solitude. The first day went smoothly. I ordered takeout, watched a few episodes of my favorite show, and lounged around. As the evening approached, I felt a little uneasy, but I brushed it off as a result of too much caffeine and a lazy day. I locked all the doors, checked the windows, and turned on a few extra lights, just in case. My parents' house wasn't big, but it had a long hallway that always felt a bit too dark, even with the lights on. I settled in the living room with a blanket and my phone, ready to scroll through social media until I fell asleep. The sound of rain began to tap against the windows, and I smiled to myself. There was something comforting about being warm and cozy while a storm raged outside. Around midnight, as I was dozing off, I heard a noise. It wasn't the usual creaks of the house settling or the wind outside. It was a distinct thud, like something heavy had been dropped onto the floor. My eyes snapped open, and I sat up, heart pounding. The noise came from upstairs. I stared at the ceiling, listening intently. My mind raced with logical explanations. Maybe something had fallen over in my room, or perhaps I hadn't closed a window properly, and the wind had blown something off the shelf. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Then, I heard it again, a slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was up there. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I quickly dialed my best friend, Emma. She lived just a few minutes away, and I needed to hear a familiar voice. The phone rang twice before she picked up, her voice groggy from sleep. "Hey," she mumbled. "What's up?" "Emma," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think someone's in the house." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then her voice sharpened with concern. "What do you mean? Did you call the police?" "No, I don't know if I'm overreacting. I heard something upstairs." "I'm downstairs in the living room. Stay on the phone with me," Emma said quickly. "I'm coming over. Just stay where you are, okay?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, clutching the phone tightly as I listened for more sounds. The rain had picked up, drumming harder against the windows, masking any noise from the rest of the house. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, just as I was starting to think I had imagined it all, I heard it again: footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming down the stairs. My heart raced as I stared at the doorway leading into the hallway. The living room lights were on, but beyond that, the house was shrouded in shadows. "Emma," I whispered urgently, "I think they're coming downstairs." "Hang on," she said, her voice strained with panic. "I'm almost there. Just stay calm." I tried to control my breathing, my eyes locked on the darkened hallway. The footsteps continued, steady and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. I couldn't see anything, just the empty doorway, but I could feel it. Someone was there, just out of sight, lingering in the darkness. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the front door, and I jumped, nearly dropping my phone. My mind raced with fear. Had they gotten outside? Were they trying to get back in? But then I heard Emma's voice shouting through the door, "Open up, it's me." Relief washed over me as I bolted to the door, unlocking it with trembling hands. Emma rushed inside, her face pale but determined. She grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. "Come on, let's get out of here." I didn't argue. We ran out into the rain, not stopping until we were safely inside her car. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house. It looked so ordinary, so calm, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had heard. We called the police from Emma's house. They searched my home but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing out of place. They told me it was probably just my imagination, that the storm had played tricks on my mind, but I know what I heard. The deliberate footsteps, the presence just beyond the doorway. I never found out who or what was in the house that night. But ever since then, I've never felt truly alone in that house again. Something lingers there, in the darkness, waiting. I've always loved having the house to myself. There's a kind of peace that comes with being alone, no one asking for anything, no noise but what you make yourself. So when my parents went out of town for the weekend, I was actually excited. A weekend of solitude, Netflix, and junk food sounded perfect. That first night, everything was normal. I made some popcorn, settled into the couch, and started binge watching a horror series I'd been saving. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, but that never bothered me before. It was an old house, after all. Creaks and groans were just part of its character. But then, around midnight, something changed. I was halfway through an episode when I thought I heard a noise, faint, but distinct. It wasn't the usual creak of the house settling. It was sharper, like a soft thud, coming from somewhere upstairs. I paused the show and listened, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, I heard it again, a dull thump, like something heavy had fallen or been moved. My heart started to race, but I tried to calm myself. It could have been anything. Maybe a window had been left open, and the wind had knocked something over. Or maybe the cat, except I remembered, we didn't have a cat. I took a deep breath and decided to go check it out. I wasn't the type to let my imagination run wild. Grabbing my phone, I slowly made my way to the staircase. The house felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the air itself was thicker. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated. The hallway at the top was pitch black, except for the dim light spilling out from the bathroom door I'd left ajar. I stood there for a moment, listening again. Nothing, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen behind me. I told myself I was being ridiculous, took a deep breath, and started up the stairs. Each step felt louder than it should have, the old wood groaning under my weight. When I reached the top, I paused again, peering down the dark hallway. That's when I saw it. A shadow. It was there, at the end of the hallway, near my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe the dim bathroom light casting weird shapes on the wall, but then it moved. Just a slight shift, as if it was standing still but adjusting its position, like it had noticed me. I froze. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was a shadow from outside, cast by a tree swaying in the wind. But there were no trees near that window, and besides, the movement had been too deliberate, too human. I wanted to run, but I couldn't make my legs move. I just stood there, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The shadow didn't move again, but I could feel it watching me, waiting. Then, without thinking, I hit the flashlight on my phone and aimed it down the hallway. The light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. I let out a shaky breath, trying to laugh it off, but it didn't feel right. The air still felt thick, oppressive, like I wasn't alone. I backed up slowly, never taking my eyes off the spot where the shadow had been, and made my way back downstairs. I locked every door, checked every window, and turned on all the lights in the house. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, that it had just been a trick of the light, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I stayed on the couch the rest of the night, the TV on for background noise, but I couldn't relax. Every little creak and groan of the house set me on edge. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off. When I woke up, it was morning, and the house seemed normal again, sunlight streaming through the windows, birds chirping outside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with me, watching me from the shadows. When my parents came home the next day, I didn't mention what had happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, but even now, I can't stop thinking about it. I don't know what I saw that night, and maybe I'll never know. But ever since then, I've had a hard time being alone in that house, because sometimes, when the lights are off and the house is quiet, I still feel like I'm not the only one there. It was a Friday night, and I was home alone for the weekend. My parents had left for a trip, and I had the house to myself, something I'd been looking forward to all week. I planned to spend the night curled up on the couch, binging my favorite shows and eating takeout. The house was quiet, and everything felt perfectly normal. At least, at first. Around 11 p.m., I started hearing noises. At first, they were faint, just little creaks that I brushed off as the house settling, but then, the creaks grew louder and more frequent, almost like footsteps on the wooden floors. I paused my show and listened. The noise seemed to be coming from upstairs, near the staircase. I glanced toward the stairs, which were visible from where I sat in the living room. The hallway upstairs was dark, but there was enough moonlight coming through the windows to make out the outline of the banister. I stared at it for a moment, listening closely. Nothing. With a shrug, I pressed play and tried to focus on the show again, but that sense of unease lingered, nagging at the back of my mind. I turned the volume down, just in case, and tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. After all, I was alone, and it's easy for the imagination to get carried away in the dark. But then, I heard it again, creak, creak, creak. This time, the sound was unmistakable. It was slow and deliberate, like someone was carefully making their way down the stairs. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned off the TV and sat perfectly still, straining to hear. The creaking stopped. I stared at the staircase, my pulse racing. Every logical part of my brain told me it was nothing, that I was just spooking myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was there. I got up from the couch and grabbed my phone. Slowly, I approached the bottom of the stairs. The house was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing, shaky and uneven. I held my breath as I peered up the staircase. Nothing moved. The hallway at the top of the stairs was empty, as far as I could tell. But the uneasy feeling persisted. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. I even laughed a little, trying to shake off the fear. This was ridiculous. I was being paranoid. Then, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it, but it sent a jolt of fear through me all the same. The whisper seemed to come from upstairs, near my bedroom. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, just enough that I could see a sliver of the dark room beyond. I stared at that small gap in the door, trying to convince myself to go check it out. But something in my gut screamed at me to stay put. I backed away from the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't going up there. Not tonight. Instead, I turned on every light downstairs and double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows. I even called my best friend, who was used to my overactive imagination. She laughed at me at first, but after hearing the fear in my voice, she offered to stay on the phone with me for a while. I didn't tell her about the whisper. I didn't even want to admit it to myself. Instead, we talked about normal things, school, plans for the weekend until I started to feel a little calmer. Eventually, I told her I was fine and hung up. But even after we ended the call, I couldn't bring myself to go upstairs. I stayed on the couch, wide awake, the lights all on around me. I tried to convince myself that it had all been in my head, that there was no whisper, no footsteps, just an old house making noise. But deep down, I knew what I had heard. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety and exhaustion. Every creak of the house made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I dozed off just before dawn, only to be jolted awake by the sound of the front door opening. It was my parents, back earlier than expected. I've never been so relieved to see them. I didn't tell them about the night before. I didn't want them to think I was crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with me, watching me from the darkness of the upstairs hallway. Even now, I avoid staying home alone at night. I leave lights on, keep the TV playing, and never ever sleep with my bedroom door slightly ajar.